All right, well, good evening, everybody. Excited to be hanging out with you this evening, spending some time walking through some content around culture. So my name is Stephen Brozovic. I have been with Amazon. I guess we can get the slides up. I've been with Amazon for a little over 25 years. If you think about that, I joined Amazon, it was August of 1999. The world looked a little bit different back then. Amazon as a company looked quite a bit different back then. Just as a point of reference, when I joined Amazon, we had expanded from the US into UK and Germany. We had 4 product categories on our retail website. We started out, as most folks know, selling books. By that time, we had expanded beyond books into music. Our 3rd product category, an entire line of business for us, was VHS. Now think about that for a second. Like, so much has changed. But some of the things that have remained really constant for us at Amazon are the culture that we have been very intentional in creating and cultivating throughout our growth. Now we're going to dive into some of the aspects that I think have been instrumental in helping Amazon build and cultivate this culture that has delivered value to customers and to partners for many, many years. But let's start with this word, culture. Because it turns out that when I use that word, there's a lot of different pictures that come into our minds. And I'm just going to make a disclaimer. I'm not a sociologist. I studied music in college. This is not my background. And you even find that if you go and search for a definition for culture, you'll find that even sociologists don't necessarily agree on what culture should be. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about culture within the context of Amazon. I started my journey on our technology platform. I was part of our retail platform team for about 13 years. I got to see a lot of dramatic change as we expanded into new lines of business, new regions in the world, new languages, a lot of new functionality that came out. I was part of that team when we ourselves started to migrate onto this brand new thing called AWS. And as fascinating as the technology was and continues to be for me, I really became intrigued by the people part of that equation. Because it turns out that whenever you inject new technology into an existing organization, it requires a shift on the part of the people to really be able to take advantage of that new technology. And so about 12 years ago, I took a strange left turn out of tech into the wonderful wild world of HR. Now, I know I just alienated a lot of people in the room. That's okay. We're going to get there. But I spent some time running the Amazon Culture Program, and then I was part of our executive development team. I ran talent management as a function for AWS as we grew from 30,000 employees to more than 90,000 during that period of time that I was there. So we've seen a lot of change. But I've got to spend the last 5 years or so having conversations like these with customers and partners from every industry segment around the world. We see common patterns of how human beings tend to solve problems. And I will tell you, we haven't figured everything out. Working with humans is messy. It's hard. It's challenging. And so I'm going to make that big disclaimer. What I'm going to share with you is what has worked with Amazon, and I'm not going to say it's the right approach. You each have a unique set of challenges, a unique set of capabilities and customers that you're working with. And so we can't pretend that what has worked for Amazon will automatically transfer to any other organization. At the same time, as we have worked with organizations across every industry segment, we do see these common patterns. And so we want to share some of the perspectives in our own journey. So let's start with this word, culture. As I said, even sociologists don't necessarily agree within themselves what the right definition is for culture. So I'm just going to offer you a working definition. It's one that I like. I think it's useful for us to think about the different components that create culture. First, we start with mental models. These are the pictures that you and I make of the world. We filter what we see and experience in the world through a set of mental models. These might be beliefs. These might be experiences that we've had that have taught us lessons, but this is the lens through which you and I experience the world. Because of our mental models, we take action. We behave in certain ways. And typically, when we as humans interact with the world around us, we create artifacts, evidence of that. So let's just have a quick demo or example of these things coming into play. There's a story about a while back, then President Obama was visiting Seattle. And the story goes that he was in his hotel room late at night, and he's looking out of the hotel down to the streets. And there are no vehicles on the streets. Completely, no cars at all, but there are pedestrians. And he noticed something a little odd. In Seattle, most pedestrians will walk up to the street corner and they will wait. There's no cars. They will wait, and then when the light changes, they'll proceed across the street. Now, I hadn't really ever thought of that until several years ago. I was in Sao Paulo. And I stopped because there were no cars, but the light was red, and what happened? Every other pedestrian pretty much runs me over, going, "You dummy, what are you doing? There's no cars, go." Right there, you see evidence of a difference in mental models that resulted in a different set of behaviors. Now, I'm not going to say which behavior or which mental model is correct, because you can understand and argue logically from whichever perspective about which one you think is right. So as we think about the way that we interact in the world, we start with a set of mental models. From there, we behave and we create artifacts. Let's spend a little bit of time digging into this concept of artifacts. And to do that, I want to use one of my favorite historical artifacts. This is known as the Antikythera mechanism, or the Antikythera mechanism. It was discovered off the coast of a Greek island called Antikythera by sponge divers. The year was around 1902. And they were diving and collecting sponges, and they came across the wreckage of a ship. And so naturally, they're very curious about what that is, and they found all the things they would have expected to find. Statues, amphorae, all of the evidence of a commercial vessel of some sort that had crashed and sunk. And amongst the wreckage, they found this really oddly shaped lump of bronze. Now, they had no idea what it was, but they could tell by looking at it that this was not something that had grown on the sea floor. Clearly, somebody did something to make that thing be there. Now, it ended up, they got some people together, they pulled it up out of the water. It ended up on the shelf of a museum for more than 50 years before a British scientist started to become interested in this device. But it actually wasn't until the 1990s that scientists started using medical imaging technology to look inside ancient artifacts. And when they applied that technology to this device, they were astonished by what they found. This device was comprised of more than 33 precision-cut gears. As they used the technology, they were able to even find inscriptions on the gears that gave clues as to what this device is. They have now reconstructed this device. And they believe it was housed inside of a wooden box. On the back side of the box were dials, where you could actually set the date, and then you could turn the device over, and on the front was a moving representation of the sun, the moon, and the 4 visible planets. You move a knob on the side, and this device can accurately predict solar and lunar eclipses. They have carbon dated this device to somewhere around 200 BCE. There is nothing in the historical record this sophisticated for another 1,500 years. It's a pretty crazy device. Now, as humans, we have developed disciplines around these types of things. When we run into something like this, and the discipline that we've created is archaeology. Now, again, music major, not my background, so I'm not claiming to be an archaeologist. I just like watching a lot of documentaries. And when we run across objects, so this is my interpretation of what archaeologists do, right? We find an object. We say, what is this thing? And we've just had a little conversation about what we think this thing is. But then the next question we tend to ask is, well, how did it get here? Now, the ship sunk by the Greek islands, and we also know, by looking and examining history, that the Greeks were very famous for their mathematics. And so it's very possible that they knew the right gear ratios and were able to set this device up to function the way that it did. But there's some oddities about it. For example, the calendaring system that shows up on the backside of the device has some inscriptions on it that seem very similar to Babylonian calendars. Now, what's even more odd, and I will say there's a school of thought that certain people will believe that this device is evidence of extraterrestrial interference in Earth's timeline. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you which one of these is the right one, because the truth is, we weren't there. We can think one is more probable than another, but none of us know for certain. So the first question we tend to ask is, what is it? The next question we tend to ask is, how did it get here? And all of that is because, as humans, we're really trying to understand ourselves, and one of the ways we try to understand ourselves is by examining how humans interacted in the past. And so we want to ask this third question: why was it made? Somebody had an idea, and they built this thing. Why was it made? Again, we can hypothesize. We can create some theories around it. One theory might be this was a way for a wealthy family to show off their wealth, right? The evidence of the shipwreck would either look like the spoils of war, or it was some wealthy family moving their goods from one part of the Mediterranean to another. And so was this a way of showing off? Or was this perhaps some sort of a fortune teller? Some of the symbols on the backside in that calendaring system are astrological symbols. And again, that's why kind of the Babylonian influence is seen here, because the Babylonians had, as part of their culture, astrology was a major component of that culture. And yet there's other people who will also say, no, we think this is some sort of a navigational aid. Because how handy would that be to know ahead of time whether you're going to have an eclipse, whether it's a solar or lunar eclipse? At this point, you're probably wondering, I came to reInvent. I thought we were going to talk about technology. Why is this guy going on about archaeology? Bear with me just a second. As you see these three questions that we ask in archaeology, they map on really neatly to this model of culture. Because the truth is, this object came to be the other way around. Somebody started by having a discussion, a conversation, dialogue, debate that led to an encapsulation of a mental model. They then took action. They behaved based off of that. And because of that, they then ended up creating an artifact. And here's where this starts to tie into our organization and yours as well. Because what is true of global culture is also true of local organizational culture. Mental models are key in shaping culture. And as I put up this slide again, you can probably, each of you, start to think about what are some of the mental models at play within my organization? How are my people behaving based off of those mental models, and what are the artifacts that we produce? Now, I want to drill into this idea of mental models a little bit further by sharing some of Amazon's mental models. So at the top of the list for Amazon is our company's mission. Amazon's mission is to be Earth's most customer-centric company. Cute tagline, right? Isn't that a great, inspiring motto? Now stop and think about how powerful that statement can be if I actually start to use it to evaluate the decision I'm about to make. The number of times that we're involved in some activity and we stop and ask ourselves honestly, how does this make life better for the customer? What decisions are we not going to take if we start to have that focus? And so we find that this mental model is a really powerful one to help us prioritize. There's a lot of things we could go do. What's that work that's actually making life better for the customer? Now, we don't find it sufficient. It's a powerful mental model, but it's not sufficient to help us run our organization. And so we have developed a set of leadership principles, 16 leadership principles that are used daily by people across Amazon, and they impact the way that they think and the way that behave. I'm not going to walk through all 16 of them. These are publicly available. If you're not familiar with them already, you can go look them up. I'm going to share 2 of them with you. And we're going to draw some lines between those mental models and then the actions that take place in the organization. The first leadership principle I want us to look at is ownership. Now, as soon as I say the word ownership, you already have an image in your mind, because the word ownership is a common use English language word. And that's the challenge. If I stop at the headline, I'm allowing everybody to operate perhaps with a different set of assumptions about what exactly do we mean by ownership. And so at Amazon, in addition to the headline and all these leadership principles here, we give a little paragraph of text to provide clarity for every person working in the organization about how this should show up in the work that we're doing. So we say ownership. Leaders are owners. Well, let's stop and have a quick definition. When we use the word leader, we are referring to every individual in the company, not just people in formal positions of authority. Because we understand that every one of us as humans has the ability to impact and influence the behavior of others. That's a common and simple definition for leadership. So we say leaders are owners. Now, we mean that figuratively in that every one of us has an area of responsibility and we have goals and objectives and we hold ourselves accountable to those goals and objectives. We mean it literally as well. Because at Amazon, we have chosen a compensation approach which includes stock as a major component in everyone's compensation. Not just select few. Everybody gets stock. Why do we do that? Well, we think that if you own something, you treat it differently. I'd challenge you, how many of you have ever taken a rental car for an oil change? It's probably not going to happen because it's not your car, you don't care. But if you don't take your vehicle for an oil change, you know you're going to deal with the consequences. And so that's why we go a little bit deeper. We say they think long-term. And don't sacrifice long-term value for short-term results. The next sentence, they act on behalf of the entire company beyond just their own team. Now we're starting to mess with human nature. Because humans by nature are territorial. We tend to even subconsciously sub-optimize for whatever is closest to us. But if I'm an owner in the whole company, I'm not successful if my part of the organization hits their objectives and the other part doesn't. It changes how I think, it changes how I'm going to make decisions, and then the last sentence says they never say, "That's not my job." Again, we're messing with human nature. If somebody caused a problem and it wasn't my fault, my normal reaction is going to be, "That wasn't me." And yet we understand something pretty fundamental. At the end of the day, the customer doesn't care whose fault it was. The customer cares that there's a problem that happened. And so the attitude that we have to take inside the organization is that every one of us is accountable for the results. Every one of us needs to be able to be involved where it makes sense for us to be involved. So this is ownership. Now, if all I had was ownership, I don't know that I could build a sustainable business because ownership is very inward looking. And so we need other mental models at play to help balance out and add tension to the picture. Because we understand that the mental models that we create and we write down are going to drive intended behavior within the organization. So the next leadership principle we'll look at, it's actually our kind of first and primary one, is customer obsession. It says leaders start with the customer and work backwards. What do we mean by working backwards? Well, in a lot of organizations, motion begins by what we know how to do, right? We typically get our group together and we say, what do we know how to do? What do we know how to go build? And then we go organize that way. A lot of organizations work this way. They organize based off of their capabilities, identify a customer market segment, build a product, take the product to market, and that's a really successful model for a lot of businesses. At Amazon, we're intentionally choosing to do it the other way around. We want to start with a clear understanding of who the customer is. What's the problem or opportunity that that customer has? And only when we've identified that do we begin even talking about the potential technology that might help us go solve that particular customer problem. If you want to understand how Amazon went from selling books, music, and VHS tapes to building low Earth orbit satellites, it's that sentence. Because when you start with the customer, there's always going to be something we've not thought of before. Customers stretch us. This is one of the reasons why we love times like reInvent, when we get to sit down with you and hear from you about all of the crazy ways and amazing ways that you are using the technology that we're building. 90% of what we have built in AWS, we can connect back to a customer that had a particular problem or opportunity. So customer obsession is the drive, it is the engine of innovation for us. Next sentence, they work vigorously to earn and keep customer trust. Amazon's a big company. We've got a lot of amazing products and services, but one of our most precious resources is the trust that customers place in us. And so now think about the impact of that statement to the decision that every employee at Amazon makes every single day. if I'm about to take an action and I pause and I say, is this action going to help build customer trust? Or is there the possibility that this erodes customer trust? Which decisions am I not going to take now? Because I understand how this is going to impact customer trust. How much more authority am I willing to delegate to people on my team to make their own decisions if I understand that they are using these principles to help make high judgment decisions and understand where those guardrails exist? The last sentence is interesting. Although leaders pay attention to competitors, they obsess over customers. Of course we should pay attention to what the competition is doing. There's a lot of smart people that don't work here. It would be foolish for us to ignore them. At the same time, we can never allow what the competitor is doing to distract us from customer needs. Because they themselves, the competitors, are always going to be at least 1 or 2 steps behind true customer needs. So yes, pay attention, but really focus and obsess about customers. So I said, when we articulate these mental models, they drive intended behavior, sometimes in surprising ways. So I want to share with you an example from Amazon's past. As you know, we have software development teams all over the world working on different components of our retail website, of the functionality that ensures that we get product to customers when they need it. We had a team, a couple of software engineers that were based out of Chennai. And they were responsible for a portion of the fulfillment center operations software. And so they had traveled from Chennai to go be on the floor in Hebron, Kentucky, and watch their software being used by the workers at the fulfillment center. If you haven't done this practice yourselves, highly encourage it because you learn a lot when you actually see the people who have to use your software. It can be very humbling at times. And so they had traveled all the way out here. Now, it happened to be that this was in the ramp up to the holiday season. In fact, they were still at that fulfillment center when the last truck carrying the last set of Christmas delivery items left the facilities. There were no more trucks going to be able to make it by Christmas, and they found a package on the floor. It somehow had fallen off of the conveyor, hadn't made its way onto a truck. And these engineers said, this is not good. Trust is difficult to earn and easy to break. And so they didn't spend a lot of time like going, well, who is the customer and are they important or anything like that. They said, no, we need to figure out what it's going to take to get this package to the customer. And so they looked, can we charter a plane? What happens if, all these different options they looked at, none of them were going to work. And then they remembered, you know what? Our flight home to Chennai has a long stopover in JFK in New York. So what did they do? They took the package with them to JFK Airport. They rented a car and they drove up to Mystic Court, Connecticut, hand-delivered a copy of that package to the customer, and then got in their car, drove back, and flew back to Chennai. That's insane. Like, who would do that? Why would we do that? This is an example, though, of when those mental models actually drive behavior in sometimes surprising ways. And you may look at that and go, that's an incredibly expensive decision. Why in the world would they do that? But here's the thing. If we break trust with a customer early, sometimes that's the only experience they're going to have with us. But now think about it from this perspective. Maybe that first early customer is somebody that's going to, 5 years from now, be making a very important financial decision that could actually impact a major source of revenue for you as an organization. If we aren't intentional at helping build that culture and that trust over time, we will deal with the long-term consequences of that. Now, one of the reasons we write these things down, and one of the things I've seen and observed at Amazon, is that if we don't spend time talking about and leveraging and enforcing these mental models, they will erode over time. So this is what I think happens. So you can imagine you've got a team working on something. Maybe it's your leadership team. Maybe you've got a dev team that's putting something together and they're building something new. Now, because they're all in the room or they're on the call at the same time, there's a lot of shared understanding. Everybody involved in the creation of this process understands the mental model. They've had the arguments and debates about why we're doing this and why it's important and what we should be thinking about as we do it. They likely are part of the solutioning, the behavior that creates the new process, the new approach, the product, whatever that might be. And as a result, when they produce the artifact, there's a lot of clarity. about what this thing is, what it's supposed to be used for. Here's the problem. As we inject distance from that decision, that could be distance in time, that could be organizational depth, that could be geographical depth, what tends to happen is this. The artifact persists. The tool, the process, the procedure, whatever that might be, the artifact tends to persist. But the behavior, and most importantly, the mental model that led to the creation of the artifact, tends to become less distinct and understood over time. And this is why, I believe, why company cultures erode over time. Because when we as humans encounter an artifact we don't understand, we all turn into amateur archaeologists. It's just what we do. We see an artifact and we go, how'd this get here? Who created this? And what tends to happen, though, is that we use our own mental models to filter out all of the hypotheses and come up with the one we think explains why this artifact exists. And then there's some very particular organizational behaviors that tend to happen as a result of that. If the story I've painted doesn't make sense to me, I tend to reject the artifact. Y'all are crazy for doing it that way. We should try it this other way. Throw it out. I don't want to do it. That's maybe not the best way to react to something new that you haven't seen before. But we also see the opposite happen, where people are like, I don't know, Form 27B, no idea where it came from, but boss wants me to fill it out, so I guess I'll just fill it out. I don't know why, I'm just filling it out. And then what tends to happen is that the artifacts we produced actually are not very good anymore, because they're no longer connected back to the actual original mental model and the behavior that led to the creation of this thing in the first place. And the truth is that all of our organizations produce artifacts. Some of them are very enduring. Physical structures tend to last for a long time. But this session itself is generating artifacts. I'm sure we've got log files that are running somewhere. We've got data that's being generated from this session. This is part of an artifact. So some of the artifacts in your organization are very ephemeral, and others are much more permanent. Now, I'm going to talk about an Amazon artifact. Just to put this in context again, let's take that term artifact and let's say, what's an artifact from Amazon? Many of you might have had some exposure to this. I'll just hit this really at a high level. We have this process we call working backwards, which is before I've assigned a team to start building, before I've dedicated any headcount or any budget toward an idea, I stop and I have to write a press release as if the product is already live and being used by the customer. I'm imagining a world, maybe 1 to 2 years in the future, where my product is in the customer's hands. First paragraph, who's the customer? What's the problem or opportunity that that customer is facing? Next couple of paragraphs, what is it that my product does that makes life better for the customer? Not how. Technology is irrelevant at this stage. What is the behavioral change that's possible for the customer because this idea now exists? Next couple of paragraphs on that press release might talk about how this product fits in with the other products that we've already put in customers' hands, or maybe it's an internal perspective about how we think this is actually going to grow the business and customer adoption in other areas, whatever that might be. We limit ourselves to a single page for that press release. If you've ever done any creative writing, you know it's difficult to be compelling in a short amount of space, but we force ourselves through that exercise to get really clear on this is why it matters to the customer. Now, with the press release, as I work on this, I'm going to start compiling a set of FAQs. These are questions a customer might naturally ask after hearing about the idea, maybe from a neighbor or a friend or a colleague. These are also places where internal stakeholders get to ask questions. And by the way, if there's that really uncomfortable question you hope no one asks you about your big idea, you put it front and center in the FAQ. We may not have an answer to that problem yet, but we have to be honest with ourselves and be willing to ask those hard questions and know we're going to have to come up with an answer for this before we actually go forward with the idea. The third element of the working backwards process is some kind of a visual representation of the user experience. We want to go lightweight here. Don't produce something flashy and glossy because we're not trying to sell the idea. We're trying to test the concept. And so we want the idea, and we say the graphics should match the fidelity of the idea. If this is an early stage idea, we're talking simple wireframes and some sketches. Don't get fancy. Why? Because we don't want to get into a debate about which color of blue we're going to use on the interface. That's way down line. We need to first become convicted about whether or not this is actually going to make life better for the customer. And the press release is a fantastic process by which we do this. This is a tried, tested, and well-used process at Amazon. Every product we've ever built in AWS started as a press release. AWS itself as a business began as a press release that went through something like 47 iterations before we funded the first dev team to start working on it. It's a lot of work up front. But what it gives us is clarity of vision and direction, and actually, it tends to be a fantastic low-cost way for us to identify bad ideas, because we can often catch them while they're still on paper. So this has been a hugely useful process for us, both for external stuff. I spent 11 years in HR. We write press releases as well in HR. Why? Well, because I've just got to be honest. HR, we tend to like to solve our own problems. And this helps us really focus and make sure, wait, is this thing that we're talking about building something that our employees would even care about? And if not, why are we spending the effort on there? So we use this process. We love it a lot. But we suffer from the exact same challenge that every other organization has, in that it's an artifact and it doesn't always show up the way that we expect it to. So many years ago when I was part of our executive development team, we would have this offsite. It was a week-long offsite. These were leaders who were director level and above, who had been at the company for more than 3 years. They'd been hand-picked for this offsite by our senior-most leaders. These are people who have a proven track record of delivering value for Amazon. And we were asking them to go inspect the working backwards process within their organizations. And so we have a little bit of a teach piece, and then they break off into groups, and then they're having this discussion amongst themselves. And so I'm a facilitator. I'm, going to lean in and listen into this group and give some feedback, and and so I'm kind of navigating the room, and I come across a group, and there's a leader there. He's been at the company for 3 years, and he's proud of the fact that during his 3 years he has never written a press release. So I have to be a good facilitator, pick my jaw up off the floor and lean in and say, tell me more. And what he did is he shared with me all of the reasons he had determined about why this process was just bureaucracy. It was just slowing him down. It wasn't getting him what he needed to do. Now, mind you, smart, motivated, passionate, energetic person, coming to some logical conclusions that unfortunately are really far away from the mental models behind our working backwards process. And so I share this as an example. As an organization at Amazon, we're not immune from drift, from cultural drift when the artifact persists and the mental model and behavior don't necessarily go along with it. And so I just want to offer up, this is a really simple exercise. I've done it both inside and outside of Amazon in lots of different groups. And it's, any of you could do this with your own teams. Super simple process. I just grab a sheet of paper, I divide it up into grids. The first column, we as a group are going to select 2 or 3 leadership principles, 2 or 3 artifacts. What are our company artifacts? Maybe it's our product, feature request process, our PFR process, or maybe you've got some kind of budgetary process that's in place or something like that. You each have an artifact. So we as a group decide these are the 3 artifacts we're going to inspect, and then independently, everybody on their own has to fill out the next 2 columns. First column, why was it made? You don't get to talk to anybody. You have to give me your interpretation based off of, what's your best guess about why this process even exists? Why did they make it? Third column is really interesting because it asks the question, what does it teach? And here's the thing. Every meeting that you have teaches something. It teaches the people involved in that meeting what you value, what you prioritize. It teaches people how to have arguments with each other in a way that's socially acceptable within the bounds of the company that we are working with. And even the artifacts that we have can potentially teach us the wrong thing. Case in point, as a young manager, I remember being given the task and responsibility. Here's our budget for the year. Here's my head count. And I was responsible for deciding how much of the allocated budget I was going to distribute among people on my team. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about each person on the team and saying, you know, I'm going to give her a little bit more here because of this work that she's been doing and she's really growing. I'm going to give him perhaps a little bit less because, or, you know, I did all this work and, you know, finally I click submit. It's done. Whew, good. Okay. I log into the tool the next week. All of my values have been changed. So I reach out to my boss and I say, what's up? Like, did I do something wrong? I stayed within the budget, or did I misunderstand? And he's like, oh, no, we just had to balance things out, so my HR partner and I just went in and modified stuff. What did that teach me? It taught me that my perspective was not valued. It taught me that I had been given ownership in lip service, but I hadn't actually been given authority to make the decision that I was being told. That taught me something very different than what everybody intended it to teach me. And so in this process, it's been fascinating as I run this process with groups. Sometimes I have the originator of the idea in the group. And when we compare answers, people who've been working together for years come up with very different answers in those other fields. And what that can do is bring in insight for leadership as to that's why there's so much conflict around this particular area or this issue. Because we understand, if we can take the time to align, to create and cultivate these mental models, what they end up producing for us is business alignment in our decision-making process and direction. Now, if I were to paint the ideal photo of a well-aligned team, it looks like this, right? I got everybody moving as fast as they can, and we're all headed in the right direction. Reality, unfortunately, looks often more like this. Anybody else identify? We've got a lot of activity happening in the company. Everybody's working hard, but we are all over the map. Now, hopefully, you've got a better handle on this than we maybe had at the time. And so maybe your organization looks a little bit more like this. You've got a common starting point. People are launching. But you can see if we don't take care of this at some point, we're going to end up all over the map again. Now, this is a common problem with every single human organization. As you grow, this is a challenge. The pattern that has emerged over time is that we end up doing something like this. Well, we can't just let everybody do whatever they want. We need some kind of a process, whether that's a manager that's giving an approval for something, or a policy or process to ensure that what we are building is the right thing, that we're delivering the right results. And guess what? This approach works. We do deliver the right results at the expense of speed and with tremendous waste of individual motivation and energy. What if instead we could actually use a set of mental models that can act like a lens on our activity? If we share those same mental models, we will work in a way that actually yields aligned results. But there's a fundamental flaw with this picture, because it assumes that I have the right mental models. And so I've found a far more useful picture is this one. And I know the font is tiny on this slide, but my favorite 5 words at Amazon are unless you know better ones. These are our leadership principles, unless you know better ones. These are my ideas, unless you know better ones. It's an open invitation because guess what? None of us has perfect truth. And the only way I get to a better answer than the one I walked in the room with is if I'm willing to consider the possibility that I might be wrong. And that someone who has a different lived experience than me can see the problem from a different perspective and offer me that little nugget of wisdom that helps us adjust course a little bit and yield a better result. When we together spend time wrestling with these mental models to refine them, that's how we end up with something durable like those leadership principles that continue to drive behavior for Amazon. But the articulation of the mental models is not sufficient. It has to be lived. And for that at Amazon, one of the things that we've come to realize and understand is that the mechanisms that we use actually teach and reinforce the mental models. Now again, I'm using a common English word, just like ownership. Mechanism is a common English word, and so we need to spend a little bit of time defining at Amazon what do we mean when we use the word mechanism, because we have a very specific construct in mind. Mechanisms convert good intentions into results. It's a complete process, reliably converts inputs into outputs. It's a virtuous cycle that reinforces and improves itself over time. Now, I know there's lots of other words you could use to describe this, this diagram. It's not a completely unknown approach. It is a closed loop process. But for us, we want to understand what the outputs are. We want to work backwards to identify what those inputs are. Once we know what the inputs are, we need to build a tool that helps us convert those inputs into outputs. We need to get a bunch of people to use the tool. And then we need to inspect and make sure that what we are doing is actually yielding the results we're looking for. And then we understand that uninspected mechanisms go stale over time. So we need a process by which we step back from whatever this mechanism might be and examine it and say, what needs to change? Is there a piece of this that currently is people process that could actually be automated because we've learned the patterns enough? That iteration process. Now, this terminology of mechanism, I was at the all hands when Jeff first kind of talked about mechanisms. And he was using so because he had experienced something. One of the things that our leadership has made a habit of from the very beginning is taking time out of their regular schedule to go sit next to a customer service associate handling live calls. You want to really understand what your customers think? Spend some time with somebody who's having to deal with one of those live calls. And so Jeff was sitting next to a customer service associate, and a call comes in. And our software detects, here's the number, here's the order, here's the account history for that particular customer. Before the customer service associate even opens the connection, they point at the screen and they say, they're going to be returning this table. So they start the call, and sure enough, the customer's calling to complain about that table. It was damaged in shipment. They want a replacement or the return or whatever that might be. So the associate does what needs to be done to take care of the customer and hangs up the call. And Jeff says, how did you know? How did you know that that was what was going to be returned? And the associate said, well, actually, this is the third return I've done on this product this week. It turns out that the product isn't packaged correctly, and so there's a high likelihood that by the time it arrives at the customer's house, it's damaged. Jeff's mind is blown. How is it that we ourselves in our own company know that this product will likely be defective? Why are we okay with sending that to the customer anyway? This has to change. So what does he do? He gets a bunch of people together in a room. He has the impassioned speech about we have to try harder. 6 months later, nothing had changed. And that's when he came to the realization that when he had walked in the room and he asked them to try harder or to do better, he wasn't actually asking for change because no one in that room wanted to ship a defective product to the customer. It was that we didn't have a mechanism that helped us interrupt that process. So we borrowed some terminology from Toyota. Toyota has what's called an and-on cord. This actually predates the automobile manufacturing space when they made textiles. There's a cord that will stop the loom in motion. In the Toyota factories, persist today, you pull the cord, the assembly line stops. That's a very expensive decision. That's a decision that sometimes would be taken by management, but Toyota's perspective was every individual who cares about the quality of this is required to stop the line because that freezes the system, lets us go inspect and figure out what's going on. So what we ended up doing is creating a process we called the customer service and-on cord. At the inputs, we have customer-reported defects. Those customer service associates are engaging with the customer real-time through chat, through phone, whatever that might be. They hear about a product that might be defective. So what do? They go onto the website, and we built this tool called the CS and-on cord that overlays the retail website, and it allows the associate to remove the buyability of the product with a click of a button. No asking for approval before they do it. They can click a button, and that product is no longer available for sale on the website. It's a tremendous amount of power to put in place there. So you might say, in most organizations, hey, we launched the tool, problem solved. Not yet. You got to train the people. And this is where we look at adoption. How do we make sure that our frontline associates are familiar enough with the tool to be able to do it well? And then we need to inspect. So as soon as that cord gets pulled, somebody further downstream needs to be able to read all those cord pulls and from there decide how do we want to take action, what's the process that we want to use to resolve this. And as an output from this, it raises customer satisfaction. So these mechanisms are what we use to transform those mental models into action, into behavior. We can say ownership, but if I don't give that customer service associate the ability to remove the item, I don't really believe ownership. I believe in management making decisions. And in a similar way, we can say we are a customer-obsessed company, but unless we have a mechanism that actually forces us to be honest about customer impact, we actually are not going to build the products. We're not going to have the customer impact that we believe we want to have. And so these processes, these working backwards sessions really force that perspective to say, don't start with the tech. Don't get distracted by the tech. The tech is awesome. The tech will let you do amazing things, but if you start with the tech, you're not going to be starting with a true customer need or challenge. So let's really identify that customer need first and then work backwards from there. And then even in the way that we meet and talk about this, in those meetings, others of our leadership principles show up. We distribute these documents and we sit in a room and everybody reads the document and we have a vigorous debate and conversation. It's an opportunity for each of us to exercise, have backbone, disagree and commit. Raise your hand if you don't agree and have a conversation about why. And then at some point, we got to make a decision and move on. So how are you going to react there? It helps us insist on the highest standards. Invent and simplify. All of our leadership principles continue to be reinforced by this particular mechanism of working backwards. Now, whether working backwards is a process that you currently use or not, that's not really the point of this conversation. The conversation might be, what are your artifacts that you are using in your organization? Are you leveraging your artifacts to help teach the mental models you believe are important to sustain the growth and development of your own organizations? So to sum up, we believe that mental models are key in shaping culture. And that if we don't spend time helping reinforce those mental models, they will erode over time. Even as your company is successful, that success and growth itself can actually become a detriment to you be able to continue on your mission, unless you're consciously working to help people understand and still have debate about some of those mental models. And then when we write down the conclusion of those debates, those clearly articulated mental models can help drive alignment. We have leadership principles that happen across the whole company, but individual teams at Amazon also craft a set of tenets that act as mental model guardrails around their own decision-making. And again, the focus is autonomy and movement with the right mental model guardrails. And finally, we see that mechanisms can leverage those mental models to help solve recurring issues. And that when we use them well, those mechanisms will teach and reinforce the mental models that keep us moving in the direction of solving customers' needs every single day. I want to thank you. I hope this has been a useful session for you, food for thought.